Shaping of Gondor, as recounted by Falastier Ardinland, court scribe to Cirion, lord and steward of Gondor, in Narvigne of the year 2558 of the third age of the sun. Part 1. The Birth of Gondor. Chapter 1. The Downfall of Numenor. In the year 3319 of the second age of the sun, the island kingdom of Numenor was destroyed. Although the full details of that cataclysm and the events leading up to it do not enter into this story, and need not be explained here in full, every tale needs a beginning. Suffice it to say that for some centuries prior to her destruction, the kings of the Edain and Numenor had steadily grown in pride, decadence, and cruelty, characteristics which were driven in essence by the base fear and loathing of death. It seemed improper and unfair to these vain monarchs, and the greater part of their subjects, that the inhabitants of the greatest kingdom in Middle-earth should be subject to the same mortal frailty as all the lesser races of the world. The immortal elves, for instance, who still dwelt in considerable numbers in the West at that time, possessed endless days and unyielding vigor. They were impervious to all the ailments that beset men, and were seemingly free to savor the fruits of the world without a thought to the great unknown. Yet no elven kingdom could compare with the glory of the Numenorian realm at the end of the Second Age. Numenor had a population then of about 15 million souls, who lived in the midst of what was undeniably the mightiest and fairest civilization then in existence. Indeed, a common alternative title among the scribes for the Second Age is the Age of Numenor. 4 great port cities adorned her coasts, within which mansions, towers, and temples soared up like shining marble needles to hundreds of feet in height. Ships with tall cedar masts and billowing blue and scarlet sails daily brought in fresh cargoes of tribute and loot from Numenor's colonies on the mainland. Her markets bustled with trade and commerce. Her shipyards, quarries, and construction sites hummed with ceaseless activity, and skilled artisans labored at their crafts to satisfy the never-ending need of king and aristocracy for light, beauty, and grandeur. As for the lower rungs of the Numenorian order, there was ample meat, corn, wine, bread, lavish pageants and games, clean garments, lodgings, and material comfort for all. Even geographically, Numenor seemed to be favored, since, unlike other realms, she had no need to worry about outside threats, for she was an island, separated by thousands of miles of ocean from the rest of Middle-earth. She possessed the grandest navy, the finest sailors to be found anywhere, and possessed enough wealth to buy whatever peace could not be won. Why then, the Numenorians asked themselves, should they be forced to die on equal terms with the dwellers of dunghill hovels, shacks, and miserable thatched huts elsewhere in the world? It was a question which pressed ever greater on Numenorian hearts and minds as time went on. Numenor did not have it so easy, on all fronts, of course, for her interests did not stop at her shores. She had colonies in Middle-earth, and as early as 750 was diverting men and resources there. Although it is not known precisely when the first Numenorian settlements on the continent appeared, it is fairly certain that the haven of Londea was in existence by 800, Umbar in 1500, and Pelargir around 2000. The colonies served a number of ends. First and foremost, they were a source of easy loot and tribute for the markets and guilds of the Mother Kingdom, as well as the ever-thirsty royal coffers of the king. As well, the colonies also offered promising prospects for enterprising private citizens hungry for a little personal aggrandizement, and allowed the younger, more boisterous elements of the populace a healthy venue in which to expend their energies. Therefore, many second and third sons of the Numenorian gentry found themselves in the colonies as corsairs, rabble-rousers, or profiteers. As Numenor waxed in prosperity and grandeur, so her relationships with the other civilized races and realms of Middle-earth gradually deteriorated. By the reign of Tar Alcarine, who reigned from 2406 to 2737, Elven ships and traders were no longer anywhere to be found on the island kingdom. The dwarves, for their part, were never a seagoing people. In their growing arrogance, the Numenorian people had come to believe themselves superior to all other races, cultures, and creeds. A common Numenorian adage of the time was, be beholden only to thy blood. Blood being that of Numenor, of course. Therefore the elven tongues and arts were forbidden. So too was anything connected with Eru the One, or to the deities of the Valar, who in Numenorian thinking were responsible for relegating them to their secondary position in the scheme of things. So it was that even as the land of Gift attained the peak of its power, it sank deeper yearly into godlessness and spiritual rebellion. Not all Numenorians turned their backs on the old ways, of course. Those few who stalwartly continued to pay a reverence to the Valar and preserve friendly relations with the elves secretly called themselves the Faithful. They became the virtuous of Numenor, though the bulk of her people had many other less flattering titles for them. They were reviled as traitors and dogs of the lowest order, and regarded with the deepest suspicion and loathing by king, court, and populace alike. Naturally, they quickly found themselves persecuted and hounded wherever they went. As it turned out, the faithful had at least one respite from persecution. In 3177, a king took the scepter who adopted the name of Tar-Palantir. Tar-Palantir proved to be a throwback to an earlier era, for he had been brought up under the stern tutelage of his rigidly moral and historically mindful mother, Insilbeth, who had raised her son to conduct himself with dignity and virtue. Accordingly, upon reaching the throne, he reversed all of his predecessors' policies, becoming the only king of Numenor in the latter centuries of her existence to renounce her evil ways. It was far too late, however. Though the king could enforce obedience to his policies in the open, he could not control the thoughts of his people. Privately, most Numenorians remained rebellious towards the Valar. And though Tar-Palantir could make a grand show of worship in the temples, conduct reverent ceremonies, and order his subjects to speak Sindarin rather than Adunaic, the people participated with a lukewarm indifference. Moral corruption was now ingrained, and no king, however great, could turn the clock backwards. Nevertheless, Tar-Palantir reigned for 78 years, during which Numenor became, on the surface at least, her old self again. The faithful, rather than occupying the bottom rung of society, suddenly found themselves favored at court, and the king often called on them for counsel and company. Harmonious relations with the elves of Middle-earth were resumed, and treatment of the natives on the mainland was relaxed, a last faint echo of Numenor's past nobility and bliss. It wasn't to last, though, for events were closing in on her, ones having to do with affairs on the continent. Let us turn our attention there and see what was happening. Only one other power in Middle-earth ever seriously challenged Numenor's supremacy during the Second Age, that of Mordor. Under the steady hand of her Maya king, Sauron, the latter slowly but surely accrued in strength over the centuries, and one by one conquered or subdued the other realms of the mainland. By 1700, Mordor controlled all the territory east of the Blue Mountains except for a few isolated enclaves. Her army stood at the gates of Lindon, the greatest and westernmost of all the elven kingdoms then remaining in existence. Only a fleet provided to the latter by Tar-Minastir, the 13th king of Numenor, prevented all of Middle-earth from going down and becoming the uncontested domain of Sauron the Great. After that signal defeat, Mordor was pushed back by her resurgent enemies and forced to retire behind borders not nearly as extensive as those she had previously held. Nonetheless, Mordor still remained the strongest power by far on the continent, and not until the maturing of the Numenorian colonies did any serious rival appear to threaten her. Once Numenor did begin to make a presence, however, it was inevitable that the two would clash sooner or later. The centuries passed. Numenorian strength climbed ever upward, friction between the two powers gradually mounted, and then, all at once, the storm broke. In 3255 of the Second Age, Tar-Palantir died, and a nephew of his, named Ar-Pharazôn, usurped the throne, becoming the 25th king of Numenor. He was an arrogant, choleric man, raised in the bad old ways, and in him all of his predecessors' work was undone. The Valar were once again despised. The the faithful shunted back into the role of pariahs, and the elven tongue vanished from the islands once more. The new king was one of those rulers who, on succeeding to a throne, can think of nothing but war and aggrandizement. Therefore, after making his reign secure, he cast about him for some easy means of personal glorification through which he could better unite the kingdom under him. After all, his accession had been blatantly illegal, and everyone knew it, some moreover with powerful weapons at their disposal. To that end, his eyes fell on the continent, where the Numenorian colonies were by now having to repel yearly attacks by marauders and mercenaries in the employ of Sauron. It was a golden opportunity for martial glory, and Ar-Pharazôn set himself to the task with glee. In 3261, In 3260, a splendid armada of some 1,000 ships was gathered, and in the summer of that year it set sail, commanded by the king himself. Upon reaching Umbar, the Numenorian soldiers, perhaps 50,000 strong, disembarked and assembled, and then marched inexorably inland, smashing everything the Dark Lord put in front of them. By 3261, they had reached the borders of Mordor herself, and it was at that point that Sauron the Great, the tyrant who had once held practically all of Middle-earth under his thumb, quite suddenly capitulated. Personally coming to the camp of the Numenorian host, the erstwhile Lord of the Earth knelt down before Ar-Pharazôn and acknowledged him as his master. Although the latter's pride was undoubtedly stroked by this humiliating surrender, the king did not trust Sauron, and it entered into his head that it would be safest to take him hostage to Numenor, where he could be carefully guarded. This was done in 3262. Sauron did not remain a prisoner for long. Although outmatched in sheer military might, the Maya had many subtle resources, among them the ability to appear beautiful and wise to mortal eyes, and Ar-Pharazôn was utterly out of his depth. Wearing his comely mask and using clever words, Sauron wormed his way into the king's confidence, feeding his pride with flattery and stroking his resentment towards Eru and mortality. If Numenor, Sauron said, would forsake the veneration of the invented idols of the elves, and shake off all semblance of servitude to the Valar in favor of the being known as Melkor, why then her inhabitants would surely be freed from death. Foolishly, Ar-Pharazôn listened to this counsel, and concurring, outlawed the worship of the Valar, endorsed the veneration of Melkor, sanctioned the severest persecution of the faithful, and ordered the enslavement and oppression of all peoples on the mainland over which Numenor could extend her sway. None of this, of course, did anything at all to weaken Death's hold of the Numenorians, who, except for the faithful, also largely fell prey to Sauron's deceptions. It was Sauron himself who was the true profiteer, by 3300 becoming the chief advisor to the king, and second only to him in eminence in the kingdom. Only the faithful continued to stubbornly resist the royal urgings to move into rebellion against the Valar. Among them was a nobleman named Amandil, and his son Elendil, who were collaterally descended from the royal house. The two stoutly refused to participate in the king's edicts, and for this both were expelled from the court in 3305 at Sauron's instigation. They then retired to Romena on the eastern coast, and from there watched as Sauron carried out his most dastardly deed yet. In Valinor, according to ancient legend, there was of old the white tree Telperion. This tree was vanquished by the dark powers long ere the dawning of the ages of the sun, but part of it survived in the form of a sapling grown from a seed taken from the tree before its end. That sapling in return yielded a seed which was ferried to Numenor by the elves in the early years before corruption had set in, and planted in the court of the king. Called Nimloth the White, it became the living emblem of the Valar, and the most revered relic of the land. It was widely said that as long as Nimloth lived and flourished, so too would Numenor thrive and endure. For 3 millennia the white tree resided in Armenelos, tended and watched over by the faithful priests, until, that is, Sauron's eye fell upon it during Ar-Pharazôn's rule. Nimloth was, in the latter's view, a symbol of the mockery of the Valar, as well as a tangible reminder of Numenor's degraded position. With ever-increasing urgency, therefore, Sauron dickered for its destruction. At this the superstitious king hesitated at first, believing his realm's fate to be bound up with the tree. By 3314, however, he had weakened sufficiently, and giving in to Sauron's arguments allowed him to chop it down and burn it. Before this could be done, though, something happened which prevented the sacred plant from perishing entirely. Elendil had two sons, Isildur and Anarion. Both were noble and valorous young men, and when they got wind of Sauron's intentions, they hatched a daring plot to infiltrate the court, steal a seed, and cultivate it secretly. The scheme was carried through successfully, and a white seedling was indeed recovered, though not before Isildur received horrific injuries for his pains. From that point on, the faithful were living on borrowed time, for even though Sauron had undoubtedly had them upon his menu anyway, their interference with his plans aroused his fury to a fever pitch. Intending to put an end to the hindrance of Amandil, Elendil, his sons, and the faithful forever, he approached his royal patron and made the boldest of overtures. He said the time had come to proclaim Numenor's undisputed power and dominance throughout the world, and for all the ages. The most effective means of doing this, obviously, was by amassing the greatest armament ever seen, sailing to Valinor, and taking the land of the Undying Ones by force. In addition, Sauron pressed that all Numenorians remaining loyal to the Valar be forced to renounce their allegiance or be put to death as traitors. To this, Ar-Pharazôn listened with a grave ear. He was an elderly man now, and the shadow of death was rapidly closing in. He faced a choice. He could refuse Sauron's appeal for action, and go to his grave with a legacy, as the most glorious monarch ever to reign over the Land of Gift, and leave another to preserve Valinor and immortality. Or he could take the plunge. After some dithering, he decided on the latter, and preparations began for what was intended to be the most stupendous naval military effort ever undertaken by mortals. For years the shipyards, forges, and smithies buzzed with activity, as king and councillor looked on with satisfied eyes. As for the faithful, it was the end of the line for them. With the backing of the king, Sauron saw to it that anyone known or suspected of worshipping the Valar or befriending the elves was seized, imprisoned, and if they did not renounce their faith, burnt alive. Untold thousands met their end on Sauron's execution pyres, and the vapors from the conflagrations rose up to form a black wreath about the Numenorian coasts. So, as Ar-Pharazôn's reign drew to an end, did the Numenorian faithful go down in blood and fire. A few exceptions were made. Amandil, his sons, and grandsons were spared for last, as Sauron wished to make a dramatic showpiece of publicly finishing them off. Before he could do so, however, his attention was drawn away, for the grand armament, after 5 years, was at last completed and ready to set sail for the undying west. It was a gargantuan force, numbering, according to some estimates, up to 2,500 of single, double, and triple-tiered warships. These supposedly contained something over 100,000 soldiers and sailors, making it more than twice the size of the fleet earlier deployed for the thrust against Mordor. Its masts were tall and straight, its hulls sleek and sheer and trimmed with gold. Surely, the men of Numenor thought, it could not fail. In 3319, then, Ar-Pharazôn, in the 278th year of his life, and in the 64th of his reign, bid his subjects farewell, and stepped aboard his mighty flagship, the Alcarandas. The trumpets sounded, and the sails unfurled, and the people cheered as the glittering armada moved in splendor out of Andúnie to do battle with the Valar for immortality and mastery of the world. Sauron, meanwhile, must surely have been laughing behind his hands at the folly and delusion of the Numenorians. For in his immortal origination, he knew perfectly well that as divine beings the Valar could easily destroy any mortal army, no matter how magnificent, and that Ar-Pharazôn and his men were sailing towards their doom. At the same time in Romena, Elendil and his sons, Amandil having mysteriously died, were preparing a fleet of their own with which to sail to the colonies. It was no longer safe to stay on the island, and with Sauron now in full control, they knew that their lives would not last much longer, unless they escaped while they could. To that end, 9 ships were gathered, and the remaining faithful who had not yet been reduced to ashes squeezed into them everything of value and cultural worth they could salvage. Then they themselves boarded, cast off, and 3 weeks after the departure of the grand armament, turned their rudders east towards Middle-earth. It was none too soon. Only 3 days after the ships had vanished over the horizon, a cataclysm the likes of which never had been seen in the annals of creation struck Numenor. The Mineltarma, a high green mountain that had stood serenely at the center of the island for 3 millennia, suddenly shuddered, smoked, and then exploded in full volcanic fury. A poisonous plume of suffocating gas rose up to blanket the sky for miles about, and a river of fire flooded out from within the mountain. Nothing was spared. The mansions, the temples, the shops, the stables, the tombs, the statues, the courtyards, and all the beautiful and marvelous things which Numenor had wrought were eviscerated in a few hellish moments. Naturally, the inhabitants, including Sauron, died to a man, and once the mountain's violence was spent, it crumbled and collapsed in upon itself, forming a deep chasm into which the roiling sea poured to reclaim her lost territory. The vast tidal waves generated by this reclamation then came surging out of the epicenter like dark walls of night and overtook the 9 ships of the faithful. For a miracle, none of the vessels were sunk, but were instead borne up upon the crests and enabled to ride out the catastrophe. Nevertheless, the 4 ships captained by Elendil were separated from the rest of the fleet and driven north by storms and squalls, while those of his sons were carried away far to the south by the furious winds and churnings of the sea. Thus did Numenor come to an end 33 centuries after her foundation. Soiled by privilege, corrupted by prosperity, seduced by pride, and then at last drowned in a horrendous deluge, she had seen perhaps the most dramatic rise and fall of any kingdom of Middle-earth. Her place in history is beyond debate. No other realm ever did so much, ignoring the dark final centuries, to aid the causes of good and tolerance against those of cruelty and tyranny. No other land was more surrounded by legend and mystique, and in her destruction she spawned 2 daughter-kingdoms, which were to continue to keep the flame of mannish civilization alive throughout the trials ahead. For although Numenor was now ended, the Second Age did not end with her. Indeed, the crest was yet to come. On the continent, Mordor still existed, and still remained well garrisoned and dangerous, even without her master. It would fall to the soon-to-be-established kingdoms in exile, to preserve Numenor's memory, and continue the resistance against the Dark Power.